Memories of Nazi death camps and the slaughter of millions of European Jews in the Second World War were revived earlier this year by two trials held in France and Israel. In Lyon, Klaus Barbie was brought to trial for crimes committed against Jews and non-Jews while he was Gestapo chief of the region. In July, he was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment, but to the last he claimed he was only carrying out his duties as a soldier in wartime. Since February, a Ukrainian who had acquired American nationality, John Demoniac, has been on trial in Jerusalem. The prosecution have alleged that he murdered thousands of Jews at the Treblinka extermination camp in Poland. Demoniac says that he has been wrongly identified. Both trials have reopened old controversies to do with history, memory, and the Holocaust. And once more, the world has heard of atrocities from men and women who have had to relive yet again their personal nightmares in public courtrooms. Their stories are now sadly familiar. But 26 years ago, the trial of another Nazi in Jerusalem brought these tragic witnesses to the attention of the world, some for the first time. Today, the Museum of the Holocaust holds the records of that trial. But it was one woman's account of the trial and fundamental questions she raised about the nature of evil that were to cause a long-lasting and bitter controversy.
A significant courtroom encounter of the times takes place in Jerusalem, where one defendant entering this bulletproof glass cubicle represents...
In April 1960, Israeli secret agents had kidnapped the Nazi officer Adolf EIchmann from Argentina, where he had been in hiding since the end of the war. Eichmann had been the man who had organized the transportation of Jews to the death camps of Europe. A year later, he went on trial in Jerusalem, charged on 15 counts of crimes against the Jewish people.
Do you plead guilty or not guilty to count number 5? In the spirit of the indictment, not guilty.
This was to be Israel's first chance to stand in judgment on the Nazi genocide of the Jews. It was an occasion of great national and symbolic importance. A New York philosopher, Hannah Arendt, was among hundreds of journalists who went to Jerusalem to cover the trial. German by birth and a Jew, Arendt had spent many years studying the history of the Jews and their place in the contemporary world. Hannah Arendt, born into a middle-class German-Jewish family, was very much assimilated into German intellectual and cultural life. She was a clever student with a particular gift for literature and poetry, but she only began to develop an interest in politics and history in the early 1930s, when Hitler came to power.
It had the most powerful effect you can imagine, making her from a completely non-political figure to a political one, from a completely non-political thinker into a political thinker. A lot of people were on the run then and had to go into hiding to escape being arrested and sent to concentration camps, mostly communists. Now, she had not been a communist and never became a communist, but her sympathies went to them as the hunted ones, and it was for her a kind of human imperative to help them, which she did by offering her apartment in Berlin as a place of transit.
She had studied philosophy in Marburg and Heidelberg. She was first married when she was 23. When Hitler became Chancellor, she left Germany for Paris. There she became a guarded Zionist believing in a Jewish homeland in Palestine, but fearing the prospect of intolerant nationalism as a consequence. When Germany invaded France in 1940, she was briefly interned. A few months later, she and her second husband, Heinrich Blücher, escaped to the United States.
They then did what everybody did, which was to find what jobs they could to put together pieces of money. She did mostly journalistic work, and Blücher got a job across the river in New Jersey shoveling chemicals, and eventually Hannah Arendt's mother, who joined them, got a job in a factory, and they put together pieces of money and made their way through the wartime. After the war, of course, it was easier, and Hannah Arendt had a job as an editor at Schochten Books, which paid pretty well. And eventually, Blücher got a teaching job at Bard College in Annandale in the Hudson, so their life eased after that.
During the war years, she struggled to identify the factors that caused the rise of anti-Semitism and Nazism in Europe. In 1951, the book that offered her explanation was published. The work brought her fame and established her reputation, but as the Eichmann trial was about to begin in Jerusalem, she still had questions to ask about Nazism and the nature of evil.
Her first statements to people in letters about why she wanted to do this were to the effect that she had not been able to attend the Nuremberg trials. She couldn't travel because she didn't have citizenship at that time. And that she'd never, as she put it, seen these people, these Nazis, in the flesh. She wanted to. And that it was a kind of a debt that she owed her past. She had written the origins of totalitarianism about these people, but they were not, as it were, of her acquaintance. And so she thought here was the chance. A very personal response, not the response of a political theorist, but of someone whose life had been cut in half by these people and their regime.
During the period from 1939 to 1945, the accused, together with others, placed many millions of Jews in living conditions which were calculated to bring about their physical destruction. And for the purpose of executing the final solution of the Jewish problem, the accused committed the following acts in respect of such Jews. 1. Putting them to work in forced labor camps. 2. Sending them to ghettos and detaining them there. 3. Driving them into transit camps and other concentration points. 4. Deporting them and conveying them.
From the start, Hannah Arendt questioned the legality of the trial. Did Israel have the right to conduct such a trial? Were the charges against Eichmann appropriate?
The court will now read the following.
This case, she was to write, was built on what the Jews had suffered, not on what Eichmann had done.
The indictment, Dr. Servatius.
She openly accused David Ben-Gurion, Israel's prime minister, of mounting a show trial. The bluntness of her attack hurt many Jews.
It's true that Ben-Gurion gave the order for Eichmann's seizure, and Ben-Gurion did have in mind a trial, a public trial, not a show trial, a public trial, in which the educational part was the main thing for him. He did want, he was not interested in Eichmann, in Eichmann the man. He was more interested in Eichmann serving as a prism through which Hitlerism, Nazism, and Germany would be seen. And mostly for the benefit of the Israelis.
We're talking about a very small country, a country just a few years after the Holocaust, of course, 15 years? Many Holocaust survivors still alive, and many of them still incapable of talking about their experiences in the Holocaust to their children. So it was, the whole subject at that time was taboo. And the Eichmann trial was a collective experience for a whole country, opening up a wound. It was not before the Eichmann trial that people would openly talk about the Holocaust. And then, of course, it started to become part of, they would teach the Holocaust in schools and everything. But before that, it was very a very painful, it still is a painful subject, but it was all kept inside. And the Eichmann trial opened it up.
Here with me at this moment stand 6 million prosecutors. But alas, they cannot rise to level the finger of accusation in the direction of the glass dock and cry out, "J'accuse," against the man who sits there.
She criticized the style and tone of the opening address by the state prosecutor, Gideon Hausner, and dismissed his claim that it was not an individual who was in the dock, nor the Nazi regime alone, but anti-Semitism throughout history. This was bad history and cheap rhetoric, she wrote, and dangerous in suggesting that Eichmann was part of some mysteriously preordained destiny.
But their voice cannot be heard.
Her criticisms of what she heard in court in those opening days and her sweeping condemnation of the process of law were to cause deep pain and offense.
With the hypocritical pretense that he was interested in Jewish problems and would give a favorable response to certain requests, usually concerning trivial matters. Some Jewish leaders still thought it necessary to make some attempt at negotiating with him. And indeed, there was no other way, for he had become the master of life and death for the Jews.
One of the questions she raised which angered Jews all over the world was the highly sensitive issue of Jewish cooperation with the Nazis. From her later reading of the history of the period, Hannah Arendt had deduced that some Jewish community leaders, in their anxiety to placate the Nazis, made the task of transportation and destruction an easier one. When she wrote about it later, she caused outrage with her selection of historical evidence and her interpretation of it. As the cities of Eastern Europe fell to the Nazis, the Jews imprisoned in their ghettos were deprived of all supplies. From these communities, the Nazis had demanded leaders to whom they could issue their orders. These groups of leaders, known as Jewish councils, were continually presented with irreconcilable dilemmas of choice, one of many being who should stay and who should be sent to the camps. During the trial, Hannah Arendt heard the survivors bear witness to the struggle for life in the ghettos.
This was early in 1941. It began actually at the end of 1940, but the entry into the ghetto was in March 1941, when only 30,000 Jews remained out of 60,000 in Krakow and 80,000 at the beginning of the war. Of course, the ghetto was overcrowded.
What quarter was set up?
A residential quarter behind the Wisla. This was always the quarter of the poor.
There was also a number of physicians to treat the sick in the ghetto, but intellectuals, rabbis, shoheds, judges, writers, newspapermen, they were superfluous. They were regarded as people unfit for work, and they were not entitled to the certificate of survival.
The children in the ghetto would play and laugh. And their games, in these games, the entire tragedy was reflected. They would play grave digging. They would dig a pit and would put a child inside and call him Hitler. And they would play about gatekeeping of the ghetto. Part of the children were Germans, others were Jews, and the Germans angry and would beat the other children who were the Jews.
Hannah Arendt questioned why there was no discussion in the trial of the part played by the leaders of the Jewish communities. In what ways, she was to demand, did some of them help or hinder the Nazi process of murder? To what extent did they betray the people in their charge? At one point in the trial, she saw that sense of betrayal break out in the courtroom. A member of the public brings the trial to a halt, shouting in Hungarian, "You soothed us so that we should not run away, but you were saving your families." Hannah Arendt was to write, "Wherever Jews lived, there were recognized Jewish leaders, and this leadership, almost without exception, cooperated in one way or another, for one reason or another, with the Nazis. The whole truth was that if the Jewish people had really been unorganized and leaderless, there would have been chaos and plenty of misery, but the total number of victims would hardly have been between 4.5 and 6 million people."
To say that the Jews should have been not organized is to say that they shouldn't have been Jewish, because this was part of their whole history, their own inner organization. And there was also a reflex of some part of pride. That means now the Germans are not letting our children to go to school. We'll teach them on our own. We can't have theater. We'll have our own. The people are thrown out of their jobs. We'll organize some other menial jobs for them. That means they were acting under the presumption that they are adding to the chances of survival. Now, asking why did you participate in your destruction is knowing the final outcome of this. That means knowing the Holocaust. But the people at that time, it never even crossed their mind. Nobody ever before had heard about wholesale destruction on a conveyor belt, on an industrial basis.
When we are speaking about the societies and individuals in occupied Europe, we have to differ, we have to distinct between imposed collaboration or cooperation with the Nazi administration on one hand, and what we called real collaboration as a result of ideological identification. For instance, in Vichy France, or in the Nazi and fascist parties in Europe, we have many peoples who voluntarily collaborated with the Nazis because they have the same opinions, the same views, and they're very interested in the victory of the Nazis. But it was impossible to continue life in the occupied countries without some form of cooperation with the Nazi administration. And we have no right to handle this way of behavior as a collaboration.
I think what she was simply doing was describing how Eichmann managed to exploit the efficiency of the Jewish Council and the tight organization of Jewish communities in his process of murder. On the other hand, I think it was somehow almost necessary for our parents to believe that what she was doing, in effect, was blaming the Jews for their own murder. I think young people in America wouldn't read the book that way anymore. I think we're all perfectly capable of understanding that Jews can inadvertently, and in the exertion of power, mix themselves up in all kinds of awful things. And in some sense become, at least to some small extent, maybe not even a small extent, the agents of their own misfortune. I mean, that's what having power is. That's Arendt's view of history, this tragic view of history, which after all is embedded in the book, and which anybody who examines and uses power believes. In Israel, I think, on the other hand, there's no question but that event, you know, the question of the Jewish councils and so on, would be read as a description and not as an accusation or as an indictment. I mean, young Jews in Israel are perfectly capable of accusing their own government of involving the country in tragic, unnecessary wars. Well, why would they think it impossible for the leaders of Europe caught up in this awful sequence of events, surrounded, under siege, and making choices which are, after all, awful choices? Why wouldn't they believe that Jews were capable, to some small extent, being accomplices of their own misfortune?
The camps themselves were the final stage of the Nazi murder plan. Here, any kind of resistance or revolt was almost impossible. Hannah Arendt understood this, but she still shared with many young Israelis a degree of shame at what she saw as Jewish submission to the Nazi reign of terror. She claimed that the prosecution had emphasized the helplessness of the Jews under the Nazis at the expense of the more controversial issue of the extent of cooperation by some of their own leaders. She was outraged at the often repeated, cruel and silly question put to the survivors.
Dr. Beisky, 15,000 people were standing there and hundreds of guards were facing you. Why didn't you revolt? Why didn't you charge and attack these guards?
Guardsman, may I sit down now, please? And the witness sits down, by permission of the court.
Judge Landau, you may take a rest if you wish.
First, today, I too, after 18 years, cannot describe the feeling of fear. The fear today, when I stand before your honors, does not exist any longer. And I believe that one cannot describe it. This was a terror. The gazing itself on the hanging of a boy, his asking for mercy. There is no possibility of reacting. And the belief that the war will end one day, and to endanger 15,000 men. And even then, if we would make an attempt, where to? Near us, there were Poles, 1,000 Poles. They were also shot and killed. And 100 meters away from the camp, they had their homes where to run. But where could a Jew run to? We were in clothes. At that time, they were not concentration camp clothes, but they were all dyed yellow, stripes.
Mr. Koppel, in the past weeks, we've been watching Eichmann in his glass bulletproof box on the stage of the courtroom. We've heard some very dramatic testimony. Have you noticed any mood of his that has changed? Have you seen him react in any way to this testimony?
I can't tell very much about his moods because he doesn't react really. He doesn't give any outer signs of moods, so that I can't tell you anything about that.
Well, have you ever seen him in anger, or did you ever see him in a stage of self-pity?
No, for that again, he should be able to show signs of any mood, so I can't really judge it because he doesn't show those signs.
Does he pace around his cell or sit on his bed with his head in his hands?
The answer is yes to both. He does pace around and he does sit on his bed and he sits at his table and reads a lot.
The Jewish Council's issue caused outrage, but Hannah Arendt's description of Eichmann's character and motives was to lead to hate and vilification. During the trial, the prosecution outlined the career and social background that brought Eichmann into the Nazi Party.
After graduating from primary school, he studied at a secondary school and a technical college. As early as 1927, we find him marching in the ranks of the German-Austrian front fighters, and in 1932, he became a member of the Nazi Party and the SS. In 1933, we find him getting his military training in the SS camp at Lechfeld and later at Passau. 1934, we meet him with the rank of Unterscharführer in the concentration camp at Dachau, which served as a school for all promising SS men. Dachau was the refining crucible, the school of violence and horrors through which future Nazi leaders had to pass. It was there that they were taught the doctrine of hate, were compelled to beat prisoners and put them to death.
I came there with a certain delay, and I arrived there exactly when the extermination action was in full swing. I already said on one occasion how people were standing near the ditches and how they're falling into the ditches as soon as they were shot. And as I also pointed out during my interrogation, I saw a boy, an infant actually, shot in his mother's arms. I had already referred to my reaction then. Here I can establish the date more easily because I remember that I was wearing a greatcoat at that time, and the conclusion which is to be drawn therefrom is that this was winter.
It was so not what she expected. She too went expecting a monster. And she heard this man who spoke in platitudes, who still, after so many years, spoke what is always called Nazi Deutsch, this kind of meaningless officialese, and translated his emotional life into cliché after cliché after cliché.
When I saw for the first time dead Jews, I was utterly shattered, and this ghastly side had never left me and had a permanent impact on my nerves. It haunted me all the time. But I was compelled. I was in an iron grip of orders to continue my...
Hannah Arendt saw Eichmann merely as a bureaucratic murderer, incapable of telling right from wrong. Except for an extraordinary diligence in looking out for his personal advancement, she wrote, he had no motives at all, and this diligence in itself was in no way criminal. He would certainly never have murdered his superior in order to inherit his post. He merely, to put the matter colloquially, never realized what he was doing.
Unfortunately, I was compelled to do so as a result of my oath of allegiance and loyalty. I had to deal with the technical aspects of the problem.
The origins of totalitarianism raises a question, particularly at the very end of the book, about the nature of something that she in that book called radical evil. It raises a question and doesn't answer it. What causes, allows people to do the kind of monstrous deeds that were done in this time by these Nazis? Eichmann is an answer to that question, and the answer is a startling one. It's not the radicality of evil, like some inborn fault in human nature, but in fact what she called banality, that is people's capacity to not think, to not question whether the rules of the state are moral or immoral, to not question whether the Führer's will is something that everybody ought to just carry out without question. She posed an answer in the Eichmann book to the origin of totalitarianism's question.
But what was done was not my doing. I had the feeling of Pontius Pilate. I felt that it was not with me that the guilt lay. I felt that I was not guilty because what was being laid down at the Wannsee Conference was done by the elite, the popes, as it were, of the state. And I had to toe the line, of course, willy-nilly. This is what I thought in the course of the years which followed.
To her critics, these views seem to show that Arendt had taken Eichmann's defense at face value and that she absolved him of responsibility for his crimes.
of course, being a very original and very important thinker, Hannah Arendt. And she would not be able to recognize that he had reached what he had done by way of thinking, of identifying, perhaps only identifying, perhaps not thinking, but only identifying with a certain political movement. She would probably not recognize the Nazis at all as an ideology. Quite rightfully so, because it is a very confused mishmash of all kinds. It has no deeper coherence or anything. But for a man like Eichmann, it was a set of ideas. He believed in them. And for her, he was probably just the petty bureaucrat who had done no thinking at all and was trained to do what he was told to do. And I don't think that was true at all. And I think that he knew exactly what he was doing, and he thought that he was doing the right thing. They all did.
In 1963, almost 2 years after the trial, the New Yorker magazine carried Hannah Arendt's reports from Jerusalem. Protests broke out immediately. Her views were sensationalized. She was seen by some as a Jewish self-hater, and Eichmann, according to one newspaper, was depicted as a man with an unspotted conscience.
She knew that her interpretation of Eichmann would be controversial. She expected some controversy. She certainly did not expect what came, which was, as one of her critics put it, a war. And the war was quite unexpected and very painful for her.
It was painful for many, not only for her. It was painful for me, for instance, as a very close friend of hers, because I thoroughly disapproved of the whole spirit of her treatment of the Eichmann affair and the kind of theory she developed ad hoc to fit the Eichmann case, and which I think was wrong-headed.
I thought the book was marvelous. I had no real criticism of the book. I thought perhaps there was a certain arrogance on her part in, so to speak, personally hanging Eichmann instead of letting the State of Israel hang him. But aside from that touch of arrogance, I thought the book was very good. My husband always objected to the phrase, the banality of evil. I don't know why he objected to it to this day. But to me, the book was very good, very interesting. And it did not say what people claimed it said. But for some reason, the New York Jews, I don't know, maybe the rest of the country too, but I think particularly in New York, wanted to believe that she blamed the Jews for Hitler.
Hannah always felt herself to be on the outside. She was never a member of any group or party in a real sense. She was very proud of being Jewish, but she had a great deal of sympathy for Christian thought. At the same time, she had a great hatred, a great contempt for group thinking. She didn't believe in this sort of thing. And I have to say that, having seen it at first hand, that it seemed to me, it seemed to a lot of other people, to be a form of mob thinking, the reaction against the book, which infuriated me because it was so hysterical and so poisonous, you know. I think that she invited it in some ways, but she didn't deserve it. But I have to say, too, that I was always on her side because she had such immense feeling for all these historical questions, you see. And she had lived those questions, after all. She had shown her good faith in every possible way, you know. She never had any illusions about totalitarianism.
She was the first person to really declare that for 6 million people to be exterminated, everybody had to participate in some tacit way. That the line between victim and victimizer is a gradual and distinct one, but finally everybody has some relationship. It's not mass collective guilt, but the understanding that the way we conceive of our daily life, the way we conceive of our relationship to politics, the way we conceive of our sense of individual responsibility, all participated to make this possible. We allowed ourselves to believe euphemisms. We allowed ourselves to sort of accept something that was horrible by describing it as something that was seemingly acceptable. So instead of moving boxcars of tomatoes, we moved boxcars of people. And by organizing, instead of efficient factory, you organized efficient gas chambers. And by having all the sort of competitive instincts, how can you make how many chickens grow fast to lay so many eggs? You use the same language and same sort of professionalism to ask how quickly and how rapidly can you gas people, in what order of time efficiency. That all the instrumentalities of modernity were put to use, and that everybody participated. It was only delighted to, with exceptions, rare exceptions.
I think she judged him by his looks, by his level of education, which she regarded very condescendingly. I think the thought that a shrewd mass murderer may disguise himself as an insignificant little bureaucrat is a thought which did not cross her mind at all. I think the real trouble is that so many good people, including Hannah Arendt, seem to have a sentimental, if not kitschy, view about what evil ought to look like. They expect evil to have the demoniac appearance of Richard III, deformed and vicious. They expect evil to materialize with some kind of diabolical pyrotechnics. But banality was a very shrewd camouflage. In itself, banality of the Nazi crime had about it a stroke of a genius. They understood that by disguising the crime of a century as nothing but a bureaucratic, dreary, trite procedure, they will get away with it. Moreover, it was a shrewd way of leading or misleading billions of people into walking submissively right into the gas chambers. The carefully modulated formula of intimidation, fraud, installing false hopes was invented by a poet, not by a dreary bureaucrat. It was meant to produce a kind of submission among the victims, which would enable the Nazis to push them into the gas chambers without having to exercise physical power on every individual victim, which they couldn't have done anyway.
We always have associated barbarism with some evil in the past, that the illusion, the 19th century illusion of cultivation and of progress in civilization was shattered by the Holocaust. And what happened right after the war was simply pointing the finger on those evil people, the Germans. And beyond the Germans, the SS, the Gestapo, the bad boys, the evil men. And without sort of taking away from the evil men, she looked at the people who really made this possible, which are not only Goebbels and Himmler, but men like Eichmann, who had all the appearances of decency and a kind of modern get-along-nicks and nice guys, and had pets and married lives, and were not aberrants. One would love to think that the killers that killed everybody were simply people who were sort of on the margin of life, and evil people. And she said, well, these ordinary people like you and me. And she even went so far as to say that precisely the mentality which made such a thing possible was even absorbed by the victims, that the slave integrated some of the logic of the master. That is to say that even the victims came to think that things that were really outrageous were plausible.
Arendt was not herself a survivor of the concentration camps, and in analyzing the conduct of the Eichmann trial, she deliberately cut herself off from the highly charged emotions which surrounded the question of life and death in the camps. To many of the survivors, she displayed an insensitivity to the feelings and dilemmas of those who had lived through such horrific experiences. For example, how were mothers with small children expected to behave when offered a choice, to live alone or die with their children?
Those mothers knew what it meant because the chimneys were just a few meters away, and they were living for six months underneath them. But out of those 600, only 3 decided to leave their children, because most of them had the feeling you couldn't leave your child in this terrible moment alone, and that there are some things which are even more precious than life. And I at the time was taking care during daytime of a group of children between the age of 5 and 6, and the mothers came to me and asked me, what would you do? Now, I at that time had no children, and I said, I don't know. And because they pressed very hard, so I said, I think I would stay. And then, of course, I left the camp to go to work to Germany, and hundreds of times I asked myself, how could you have said such a thing? I mean, those were young women, they could have had other families. And then when I checked again, when I had a child of my own, I think I would have done the same. And I mean, those problems of heart never crossed Hannah Arendt's mind. It was just brilliant intellectual thinking, complete lack of heart and of compassion.
She was unrepentant when she wrote to one of her oldest friends who had been profoundly shocked by the tone of her book about what she called the unmastered past. We both know, she wrote, how often emotions are used to conceal factual truth, and although you may be right, and that it's too early for a balanced judgment, though I doubt this, I do believe that we shall only come to terms with this past if we begin to judge and be frank about it. What troubles you is that my arguments and my approach are different from what you are used to. In other words, the trouble is that I am independent. By this I mean I do not belong to any organization and always speak only for myself, for which I think no ideology, no public opinion, and no convictions can ever be a substitute.
In order to figure out just why they regarded Arendt as having violated something very, I mean, you'd almost say sacred, I think you have to see that the attenuated nature of Jewish identity in America makes for a kind of impulsive desire to hang on to something. I think what American Jews have been hanging on to is what Arthur Koestler calls a secular religion. They've been hanging on to a perception of events which looks a lot like a kind of passion play. I mean, here you have the Jews of Europe, pure victims, murdered by the incarnate evil. You have a kind of redemption 3 years afterwards. Israel rising, as it were, on the ashes of Auschwitz. So it appears to Americans. I mean, that's in fact not what happened, but that's, I think, part of the perception in America. What Arendt, I think, inadvertently did was discredit a number of these elements. I mean, she made the incarnate evil look like he wasn't such a big cheese after all. I think what her book did was violate, or shall I say even profane, the kind of sacred trust that American Jews have felt they were carrying on. It's, you know, this secular religion of American Judaism, this sort of born-again Judaism of rushing to appropriate the innocence of the victim, is deeply moving for a lot of people.
In the courtroom at Jerusalem, the stage is set for the 115th session of the trial of Adolf EIchmann. Prosecution and defense awaiting the announcement of the verdict. Adolf EIchmann, the 55-year-old former Gestapo colonel, comes to judgment before an Israeli tribunal of 3 German Jews who escaped Nazi persecution. Nearly 4 months have passed since the jurist retired to consider the massive trial evidence. Now, in a 300-page judgment, EIchmann is found guilty of crimes against the Jewish people, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. The verdict made EIchmann liable to become the first man to be executed under a civil court verdict in the state of Israel. The sentencing comes 4 days later. EIchmann to die on the gallows. He still has available to him an appeal to the Israeli Supreme Court, and if turned down there, an appeal for clemency to the Israeli president.
You know, I learned a funny lesson when my biography of Arendt was published in 1982. There's a kind of lifetime to controversies. They have their half-lives, their full lives. And this one had lived out its lifetime. The knowledge of the complexity of the totalitarian regimes in Europe and of such issues as the Jewish councils and their role in the Holocaust had filtered into common knowledge. This is no longer shocking. And Arendt's portrait of Eichmann as a banal man had become almost a cliche of its own. That the phrase, the banality of evil, is part of the language now. It's a cultural token, and even to the point where it's sometimes used as a cliche, and it's a cover for people not to think about what it means now. It's replaced the covers that it was meant to blow, and so it has changed very much. The controversies about the Holocaust now tend to revolve much more around how to preserve the memory of it.